Hello, everyone. Good morning, or good evening, or good night, depending on where in the world you are at the moment. So, I'm really happy to be here with you this week to contribute to your discussion. I am going to try and keep this post under 7 minutes. That will be a challenge because I can tell you I've done 2 before and they were way too long. I wouldn't want to subject you to something like that. So, here goes. All right. So first, I want to say thank you so much for the amazing conversations that you've been having throughout this term. And I really want to thank you for engaging with this subject matter of race, racism, and racialization in such a complex and deep manner. I'm very honored that you've engaged in such a way, and I'm elated because quite often in education, or in most places, including schools of social work, my experience I'm speaking from, when we get to talking about issues of race, people start labeling them as difficult conversations, and then a lot of the times the conversations don't happen. So I want to congratulate you for engaging in this manner. So I want to pick up on 3 things that you've identified in your discussions, and I want to expand on them, or at least give them a slightly different perspective by augmenting what you've just said. So I want to talk about the importance of history. I want to talk about the importance of Black Lives Matter and Idle no more at this particular moment in our historical times. And I also want to talk about the notion of privilege and power. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to expand on is the history. So you've touched on all the pieces that we need to touch on around the importance of remembering our history, remembering what has happened to Aboriginal people and Black people into this country, remembering slavery and different ways that colonization has taken place, including today, I might add. It continues, right? And I think what happens is, I want to say yes, but I wonder if people actually know the history, because, when I hear some comments from people, I really don't think they understand the history at all. They don't know where Aboriginal people are coming from in this country, and they don't know the historical backgrounds of Black people in this country and the contributions of both groups of people to the building the nation state. So I think there's some ignorance around our history. There's some denial around our history because, a lot of white people really need to discredit all groups of people in order to suggest that they're the superior ones and they're the ones that's built this country on their backs all by themselves. I also think there's some need for blaming somebody in the past. People will say, well, I don't have anything to do with this. I wasn't a part of the residential school situation or slavery. But there's also guilt because people actually see this issue of race and racism so large, and they have no idea what to do with it. So they hide under the rug, crawl into a cave, cover up, and pretend nothing is happening or has ever happened. So that's one perspective. But I think it's really important wherever you go, whatever you do, whoever you engage with on these subject matters, that you keep reminding people that there's a history to these different groups of people, Black people and Aboriginal people, in this country. And that's not to suggest that there are not other groups of racialized people. It's just that this week we're talking about Black people and Aboriginal people. Specifically in relation to Idle No More and Black Lives Matter, right? So I think it's important to keep the history at fore. Otherwise, people will always say things such as, where did this come from all of a sudden? Well, if it's never affected you before, it will be all of a sudden. But if it's affected you, it will not be all of a sudden. It will be your entire life and generations of entire life, right? So that's the piece around history. The piece around privilege and power. This is how I look at it. You can only afford to have, I'm sorry, I meant patience and power. You can only afford to have patience if your women and girls are not being murdered and going missing. If your children have never been dragged out of their homes, kidnapped, placed into residential schools where they were sexually molested, murdered, starved, beaten, and all other manner of atrocities happen to them. You can only afford to be patient if you have not lost your lands, your culture, your spirituality, your sense of being, your ways and your identities, and your languages. And you can only afford to be patient if your people are not dying early, than all other groups of Canadian people, if your people don't have the most health-related diseases and problems of all groups of people in Canada, if they're not been pushed out of school early, and if they're not suffering from the effects of intergenerational trauma. That's when you can afford to be patient, right? The other side of that is you can afford to be patient if your children are not being expelled from school at an alarming rate, if your people, your men in particular, are not being shot down in the streets like animals, are being jailed disproportionately, and if you're not street checked or racially profiled, and if your children are not being expelled from school. I think I said that one. Those are the times that you can afford to be patient. Nobody wants to hear be patient when you don't have drinking water. Regular everyday things that Canadians have. Some of us have drinking water that's running outside of our taps and we're just running the water, right? So really, really important that we consider these things. Patience come with privilege. You know I've been dying to say that privilege word and link it with patience, right? Privilege comes with patience, or the other way around. Patience comes with privilege. When you're privileged, you can afford to be patient because your life does not depend on it, okay? And the last point I want to make is it's really important that we have Black Lives Matter and Idle No More at this historical time in our Canadian life. Because if they don't, who is going to do the work that they're doing? And let us be clear that these two different activist movements are not new. They're different incarnations of different activist groups that have been here in Canada from the beginning of time. It's just that right now it's called Black Lives Matter and Idle No More. And in the past it was called different kinds of things. Go look at the history of SCWK, or look at the history of the Black Action Defense Committee, and you'll see that those groups of people were being activists, you know, in different kinds of ways. So let's not limit people's activism to two names and assume that this has never happened before. And the other thing is, it's really important for this brand of activism at this point in time, especially with the additional onslaught or the liberal onslaught of imperialism and colonialism in this country, right? So if these groups of people don't do it for themselves and their people, who's going to do it for them? The masses that are saying none of this is happening and where's this coming from, and that this is not the United States, so we don't have that kind of problem? I think not. So I'm on side with both group of activists, for both groups of people, both groups, for their activism and for the kind of stance that they continue to take in opposition to the racist and colonialist Canadian nation state. So that's it for me this week, and I'll talk to you next week.